No. Did somebody actually do that? I have had a little taste of how your phones get blown up. Between Travis and you, not much.
Not much?
I think you're doing great.
Before the Super Bowls, before the interviews, before the last names became brands, there was silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that lingers after responsibility has already been carried, after decisions have already been made, after someone realizes they're no longer being asked. Ed Kelce didn't disappear. He became unnecessary, and that distinction matters. When two sons rise into public greatness, the story usually stops there. The father is assumed complete, fulfilled, proud. But what happens when the work ends, and the noise moves on, and no one asks what remains? This story isn't about football. It's about aftermath, about a man who stayed present long after his presence was no longer visible, about what gets lost when identity is built around providing, and providing is suddenly no longer required. Ed Kelce didn't chase attention. He absorbed pressure, quietly, consistently, and when the world stopped looking in his direction, the silence didn't feel earned. It felt unresolved.
On the patio. And to just watch the two of them just crazy about each other.
Before we move on, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our upcoming documentaries. Ed Kelce's life wasn't organized around recognition. It was organized around function. Responsibility first, emotion later, if at all. He learned early that being needed mattered more than being seen. Bills didn't wait. Children didn't pause. Stability had to exist regardless of how it felt. So he became reliable, predictable, present. That kind of presence doesn't announce itself. It fills gaps. It absorbs tension. It removes uncertainty before it becomes visible. As his sons grew, his role sharpened. Not as a dreamer, as a stabilizer. Someone who handled what others didn't want to think about. He didn't imagine legacy. He imagined continuity. But continuity has a cost. Over time, it narrows a person's definition of self. Identity becomes transactional. You exist because something needs you. Ed never questioned that structure. It worked, until it didn't. When success arrived elsewhere, quietly, his role began to blur. And what had once felt essential started to feel conditional.
Storage Wars? You were big Storage Wars.
Never saw that in my life.
When Travis and Jason moved closer to their futures, Ed Kelce stayed anchored to routine. That was his instinct. Consistency meant safety. He watched progress happen in increments, not milestones. Practices, travel, conversations that revolved around effort, not outcomes. He wasn't preparing for distance. He assumed proximity would change form, not meaning. But progress compresses space, and with it, attention shifts. Suddenly, conversations became shorter, schedules tighter, presence more symbolic than necessary. Ed noticed the change without naming it. He didn't interpret it as loss. He framed it as success. That's what parents are supposed to do. Still, something subtle occurred. The center of gravity moved. The role of protector became observational. Support no longer required constant input, just availability. That transition didn't come with instruction or acknowledgement. It simply arrived. And Ed, who had always understood where he fit, began standing in spaces that no longer asked for him to stay.
I never got any advice on sex from Dad. We never had the birds and the bees talk.
No, we didn't.
Distance didn't arrive through conflict. That would have been easier to process. It arrived through momentum. Momentum doesn't pause to explain itself. It doesn't apologize. It just continues forward. Ed Kelce adapted the only way he knew how. He reduced his footprint, spoke less, offered advice only when asked. He convinced himself this was growth, that stepping back meant he'd done his job well. But silence behaves differently when it's chosen versus when it's inherited. The calls became less frequent, not absent, just infrequent enough to feel delayed. It didn't demand space. He respected it. That respect, over time, began to resemble invisibility. He wasn't pushed out. He faded out. And fading is difficult to confront because there's no moment to react to. No clear loss, just an accumulation of quiet. A sense that the room has changed shape. and you're no longer certain where to stand.
I did not know how to talk to girls.
You were awkward. You were uncomfortable.
Jesus Christ, I wasn't going to...
Recognition came from outside, not within. Public praise, shared pride, a last name repeated with admiration. Ed Kelce watched those moments with measured restraint. He didn't insert himself. He didn't correct narratives. He understood how stories simplify. Fathers become footnotes or assumptions, but internal recognition matters differently. It anchors identity. It didn't need applause. He needed acknowledgement of continuity, a sense that what he built still connected to what existed now. Instead, he felt archived, appreciated, but no longer active. That distinction created quiet pressure, not resentment, uncertainty. If your value has always been tied to contribution, what happens when contribution becomes optional? Ed didn't ask that question out loud. He lived it internally. And as the world celebrated outcomes, he sat with something less visible. The realization that success, when it arrives, doesn't always bring everyone forward with it. Sometimes it leaves someone standing just behind the moment.
Germans celebrate. We mentioned this last year on the podcast. I would love to do this with Dad one day.
Ed Kelce's identity had always been clear to him. Provider, protector, the person who handled what needed handling so others could focus on becoming something more. That identity didn't feel restrictive. It felt earned. But identity built on usefulness is fragile. It depends on demand. And demand, once reduced, doesn't announce its departure. As his sons established themselves, Ed noticed his role shifting from essential to symbolic. He was still present, still respected, but no longer required in the same way. That change didn't come with ceremony. It came quietly, through fewer decisions, fewer moments where his input altered outcomes. He told himself this was natural, healthy, the result of success done right. Still, something unsettled him. When people asked who he was, the answer felt less precise. He wasn't losing pride. He was losing definition. And without definition, identity begins to thin. Not all at once, but enough to feel unfamiliar.
You're not fretting about how they're doing in school, how they're treating teammates.
Ed Kelce never framed his life in terms of dreams. Dreams implied flexibility. His life required structure. Still, like most people, he had imagined a future where effort eventually softened into ease, where responsibility loosened, not vanished. He believed success would create space, time, connection. Instead, it created separation. The dreams he postponed weren't dramatic. They were ordinary, shared dinners, long conversations, presence without urgency. As his sons' lives accelerated, Ed realized those quieter dreams didn't automatically arrive. They had been replaced by distance masked as achievement. He didn't feel bitter. He felt displaced. The future he'd envisioned was still there, just reorganized without his input. Dreams don't always break. Sometimes they're reclassified as unnecessary. Ed adjusted like he always had. He told himself dreams were optional. That pride was enough. But something lingered beneath that logic, a sense that what he delayed had quietly moved out of reach.
How much trouble they got into that can be directly tracked back to you.
Public recognition is loud. It arrives with names spoken clearly and roles easily summarized. Ed Kelce's recognition had always been quieter. Understood, not expressed. Assumed, not stated. As attention followed his sons, he found himself present in narratives but absent from focus. A supporting character with no dialogue. People thanked him politely, congratulated him vaguely. Their words landed but didn't settle. Recognition without specificity feels incomplete. It doesn't anchor memory. It passes through. Ed didn't want credit. He wanted clarity. Acknowledgement of process, not outcome. But process rarely gets highlighted once results exist. He noticed how often conversations moved past him, not away from him. Subtle, unintentional. That kind of oversight is difficult to confront because it isn't intentional. It just happens. And over time, Ed felt less seen, not because anyone ignored him, but because no one needed to look.
Raising children in this world should absolutely be celebrated.
Emotional distance doesn't arrive through conflict. It arrives through efficiency. Calls become shorter. Conversations become updates. Connection becomes functional. Ed Kelce recognized the shift, but didn't challenge it. He valued independence. He respected boundaries. Still, emotional distance feels different when it wasn't requested. He listened more than he spoke, asked fewer questions, waited to be invited into moments. He told himself this was maturity. That closeness didn't require constant contact. But silence accumulates differently when it's habitual. Ed noticed how much he filtered himself, how often he paused before sharing. Not because he wasn't welcome, but because he wasn't necessary. That distinction reshaped the relationship quietly. He wasn't excluded. He was peripheral, and peripheral roles come with uncertainty. You don't know when to step forward, or if you should. So Ed stayed still, and distance, once normalized, began to feel permanent.
No, tell me.
The family drops them off at like a woods.
The fear didn't arrive dramatically. It didn't announce itself. It surfaced in small moments. When days passed without contact. When decisions were already made. When updates arrived after conclusions. Ed Kelce never feared abandonment. He feared irrelevance. Being forgotten doesn't mean being erased. It means being remembered without urgency. He wondered if his presence had become optional, if his absence would be noticed or merely accepted. That question carried weight, not because it accused anyone, but because it lacked an answer. Ed didn't ask for reassurance. He didn't voice concern. He absorbed it. That's what he'd always done. But absorbing uncertainty changes a person. It makes silence heavier. He found himself measuring his place without reference points. And for the first time, Ed considered something unfamiliar. That the role he'd lived inside for decades might not follow him into what came next.
Have a wagon that is filled with beer and different types of meats and sausages. And
The breaking point didn't arrive as an event. There was no argument, no confrontation, no moment that forced recognition. It arrived as realization. Ed Kelce began to understand that his silence was no longer situational. It had become structural, built into the way relationships now functioned. He noticed how carefully he framed his thoughts, how often he edited himself before speaking, not out of fear, but out of relevance. Would this matter? Would this add anything? Would this be received or tolerated? Those questions stayed unspoken, but they shaped every interaction. Ed didn't feel anger. He felt containment, like something inside him had been sealed without his consent. The weight wasn't emotional excess. It was emotional restraint carried too long. Breaking points aren't always loud. Sometimes they are the moment you realize you've stopped expecting to be heard. And once that expectation disappears, something fundamental shifts. Quietly, permanently.
just wander up into the mountains with a bunch of beer and sausages and they hang out together for a day.
Ed Kelce didn't collapse under pressure. He adjusted to it. That had always been his strength. But adjustment, when prolonged, becomes erosion. He noticed how his internal world had narrowed. Fewer expectations, fewer assumptions about his place. He no longer imagined himself as central to outcomes, just adjacent. That realization didn't devastate him. It recalibrated him. He stopped preparing for moments that might never come. Stopped rehearsing conversations that no longer seemed necessary. Not because he was defeated, but because he was conserving energy. Emotional breaking points don't always involve pain. Sometimes they involve detachment. Ed didn't feel less love. He felt less claim. And that distinction mattered. He remained proud, supportive, present when asked. But something inside him stepped back. The part that anticipated connection. The part that believed proximity guaranteed belonging. That belief didn't shatter. It dissolved, leaving clarity in its place.
We can wander back to the pool and do the same thing.
Clarity can feel cold when it arrives without comfort. Ed Kelce began to see his situation without emotional cushioning. He understood that roles expire, that usefulness evolves, that presence isn't permanent. This wasn't betrayal. It was structure. Still, knowing that didn't make it easier to live inside. He felt the absence of expectation most acutely. No one waited for his input. No one leaned on him reflexively. That absence wasn't rejection. It was independence. Ed respected that. He even admired it. But admiration doesn't replace connection. He realized how much of his identity had been tied to anticipation, to being prepared, to being ready before being asked. Now, readiness felt unnecessary. That shift left him with something unfamiliar, stillness without purpose. Breaking points aren't dramatic when they involve meaning. They're quiet, reflective, internal. Ed didn't react outwardly. He absorbed the change, and absorption has limits.
What do you think are Mom's chances?
Chances are
At some point, Ed Kelce stopped resisting the quiet. Not because he accepted it, but because resisting required energy he no longer wanted to spend. He allowed the silence to exist without explanation. That choice wasn't surrender. It was self-preservation. He began to observe his own patterns. How often he minimized himself. How frequently he deferred. Those habits had once been functional. Now, they felt automatic. The breaking point wasn't emotional overflow. It was emotional inventory. What remained when usefulness was removed? Ed realized he'd never asked himself that question. His life had been structured around others' trajectories. Now, without those demands, he faced something unfamiliar. Personal space. Not freedom. Space. Space invites reflection whether you're ready or not. Ed didn't feel it immediately. He sat with it. And in that sitting, he recognized the cost of staying silent for too long. Not resentment, but self-erasure. That recognition didn't undo the past. It reframed it.
In American Pickers.
There you go.
Then you used to watch the Vegas one with the
The emotional breaking point wasn't marked by tears or confrontation. It was marked by restraint becoming visible to itself. Ed Kelce acknowledged something privately, that he had been strong for so long that he'd stopped checking what strength required in return. He didn't feel victimized. He felt unexamined. That distinction mattered. He realized silence had protected others, but it had also protected him from asking difficult questions. Who am I when I'm no longer needed? What remains when responsibility recedes? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty. Ed didn't rush toward resolution. He allowed uncertainty to exist. Breaking points don't always force action. Sometimes they force recognition. Recognition of limits, of emotional capacity, of deferred identity. Ed hadn't failed. He had completed something. And completion, when unacknowledged, can feel like loss. That understanding didn't bring relief, but it created space for what came next. A shift, not away, but forward.
a reality TV show type person.
Legacy is often discussed as something inherited, passed down, celebrated publicly. But Ed Kelce's legacy existed in something less visible. It lived in stability, in absence of collapse, in the fact that progress had room to happen without chaos. He didn't leave behind speeches or lessons clearly labeled. He left behavior, consistency, emotional containment that allowed others to move freely. With time, Ed began to understand that legacy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it functions quietly in the background, long after attention shifts elsewhere. What he built didn't disappear when his role changed. It continued unnoticed because it worked. That realization softened the fear of irrelevance. Legacy, he saw, wasn't about being remembered loudly. It was about remaining present in structure, even when no one was looking, even when applause had already moved on. That understanding didn't restore what had been lost, but it reframed it.
The Chumley. What's the
Oh, the Vegas.
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So don't
Ed Kelce never framed his life in terms of dreams. Dreams implied flexibility. His life required structure. Still, like most people, he had imagined a future where effort eventually softened into ease, where responsibility loosened, not vanished. He believed success would create space, time, connection. Instead, it created separation. The dreams he postponed weren't dramatic. They were ordinary. Shared dinners, long conversations, presence without urgency. As his sons' lives accelerated, Ed realized those quieter dreams didn't automatically arrive. They had been replaced by distance masked as achievement. He didn't feel bitter. He felt displaced. The future he'd envisioned was still there, just reorganized without his input. Dreams don't always break. Sometimes they're reclassified as unnecessary. Ed adjusted like he always had. He told himself dreams were optional. That pride was enough. But something lingered beneath that logic. A sense that what he delayed had quietly moved out of reach.
Yeah. So don't give me this. Don't give me this. You're not a reality TV guy.
Meaning changed once Ed Kelce stopped measuring himself by demand. He no longer assessed his value through usefulness. He assessed it through intention. The habits he carried, discipline, steadiness, emotional control, didn't disappear when circumstances changed. They remained available. Chosen, not required. That distinction mattered. Meaning wasn't something new to build. It was something to recognize. He began to see how his influence existed quietly in others' decisions, and how responsibility was handled, and how pressure was absorbed. Those outcomes didn't need acknowledgement to exist. Ed understood, then, that meaning doesn't always follow attention. Sometimes it precedes it, then outlasts it. The silence he once feared no longer felt empty. It felt open, not demanding, not accusatory, just available. Meaning didn't restore his old role. It allowed him to redefine presence on his own terms, without urgency, without explanation.
Don't act like you're above reality TV.
You used to sit down and watch Jackass with us.
Peace didn't arrive dramatically. It settled. Ed Kelce stopped waiting for something to resume, stopped framing quiet as temporary. He accepted that this phase wasn't an aftermath. It was a continuation, just shaped differently. The fear of being forgotten loosened its grip, not because it vanished, but because it no longer defined him. His worth didn't require reinforcement. It rested in clarity. Clarity about what he had given, what he had completed, what remained his to choose. Silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space with boundaries. Peace came from understanding that his story didn't end when attention shifted. It simply stopped needing validation. That kind of peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It holds, even when the world moves on, even when no one is watching.
I was pretty much adamantly opposed to Jackass.
When Travis and Jason Kelce became legends, the story felt complete to most people. But this story lived elsewhere, in the quiet after the milestones, in the father who stayed steady when his role became invisible. Ed Kelce was never left behind because he failed. He was left behind because success doesn't always carry everyone forward. This isn't a football story. It's a human one, about the people who absorb pressure so others can rise, who stay silent so outcomes can speak. If this story made you think of someone who carried weight without recognition, acknowledge them. Say their name. And if you value stories about the unseen cost behind success, subscribe. These stories don't shout. They endure. Because legacy isn't always built on what's celebrated. Sometimes it's built on who stayed standing when the noise moved on.
I'm pretty sure.
Oh, man. But you were missing out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Your loss.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our upcoming documentaries.